Now, meanwhile, US President Barack Obama says he has no doubt chemical weapons were used during the assault in Damascus, but he's yet to decide on a response to last week's gas attack. Washington is still consulting its allies on launching a possible limited military strike against President Bashar al-Assad's government. What does the US stand to gain should it attack Syria? And does it have the right to intervene in a sovereign state? Joining me now to discuss some of these questions is international relations expert Brooks Spector. Brooks, good morning and thank you very much once again for coming in.
Good morning, Dan. Good to be here.
Let's start with the first question. What is in this for the US? What can they gain by, even if it's a limited military response to the chemical weapons attack?
Well, so far at least, they have couched this entire response in terms of violations of international norm standards and international treaty conventions. There is, after all, a treaty against the use of chemical weapons that the Syrians are parties to. And to the extent to which it is clear that chemical weapons have been used, then the Syrian government is, if they're in fact responsible for it, they're violating an international treaty. So in that sense, then, the United States is right to say what it plans to do, but at the same time make sure that it does this with the mantle of an international appreciation for this. Specifically, the British at least have gone to the United Nations to request a mandate for this. The Arab League, for example, has also indicated its enormous displeasure with the use of chemical weapons, and they're searching for a large enough coalition, the U.S. that is, so that this is not seen as an individual one-country activity.
So there's no risk of them, or a chance rather, of them going it alone, because apparently there's so much pressure with the G20 summit coming up in Russia, in St. Petersburg next week, that America would like some action to have been taken against Syria ahead of that. You don't think the U.S. will come under pressure to go it alone?
I think that's a complicating factor. You're absolutely right. It also could act as a kind of brake on the activity. That is to say, no one wants the G20 summit to blow up. The U.S.-Russian bilateral meeting has already been put on a postponement. And to make the kind of attack that's being discussed in the press just days before the G20 would almost certainly cause a rupture at the G20 meeting. So you're absolutely right to mention it, but I think we're talking about something just a little past that.
Okay, but I mean, Syria is a sovereign state. It doesn't change that. President Bashar al-Assad is still in power. I mean, should other countries be intervening in a sovereign state? Should the U.S. be leading an attack on a sovereign state?
Well, I mean, your story just before this, of course, was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There is an international force intervening. These will be different circumstances, but the violation of international law is pretty clear. What is not so clear is the mechanism by which the intervention, if it occurs, would take place. Now, in everything that I've read and everything that I've heard so far, nobody in Washington is making the argument that this is an intervention to overthrow the Bashar al-Assad government. It would be targeted at making sure that chemical warfare attacks don't take place. Now, you can say that's a fine line between the two, but I think what you would not see, for example, would be attacks on official government residences and offices, things like that.
Okay, what is not in any doubt that chemical weapons were used in that attack last week. The Syrian government is denying its responsibility. The American government, we saw President Obama yesterday talking about it. It's pretty much clear that the opposition forces, according to America, don't have the capacity of such weapons. Hence, they're leaning towards suspicion that it was something to do from the Syrian government. Let's say now they do these limited airstrikes. They use cruise missiles to targeted objects, and they've done and it's done. What next?
That's the big problem, of course, that assume that all those things take place, that stepped response to deal with the command and control facilities and then to deal with the anti-aircraft missile emplacements and so forth, so that the Syrian military capability is severely degraded, but obviously not ended. The real key question, of course, is what happens afterwards. And that, unfortunately, is a very murky area because the civil war in Syria is not going in favor of the rebel forces, that vast coalition of differing groups, some of which are not necessarily all on the same page anyway, but it is not trending totally and completely toward the government either. What this would do would make it more difficult for the government to have its reach back to weapons of last resort. I want to just go back to something you said earlier. Although it's not clear who launched the chemical weapons, it is quite reasonably true that the rebel forces don't have the technological or technical capability to manufacture, to put them in place, to make them active, and then to launch them. It's more than simply something you cook up in your kitchen. It's something that requires some serious technology, and the Syrian government over the years is known to have made a large stockpile of chemical weapons. The problem is in knowing the chain of command, and that is, again, is one of those murky areas that no one has real knowledge of.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to have to leave it there. That's international relations expert Brooks Spector.
News that moves. eNCA.com.